Unit 6, The Cycle and the Judges, Sin, Subjugation, Prayer, Deliverance, and Rest. So let's return to our timeline that we've been looking at, and we are looking at this particular area right here. This is the conquest of Joshua. And so we've looked at these events. We looked at the spies who went into Canaan, came back, gave a bad report as a result of the unbelief. We had the wilderness wanderings, 40 years. And then we just looked at the conquest of Canaan, where 6 years where Joshua basically fulfilled what God had promised to Abraham, and he acquired the land. And so going from this one now, we're going to enter this season that we call the cycle and the judges. And this is much longer, and this is a dark period of the children of Israel's history. And so we're going to look at it in this unit and understand how it fits in the larger whole. So we've got our timeline, and so now they possess the land that God had promised them. The Abrahamic covenant is now coming to fruition. And God has ordered, now that they're in the land, he has ordered them to exterminate the Canaanites. Why? Well, we said it earlier, because due to their extreme wickedness, right? That's one of the things that the Canaanites were one of the most wicked people ever, and as well as their pagan influence on God's people. In fact, we read this in Deuteronomy 7:4, where it says, God is talking and warning the children of Israel, says, "For they," being the Canaanites, "will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. And so the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly." So here again, what covenant do we see at play? We see the Mosaic covenant here, where God will protect them as long as they're faithful, but if they turn to other gods, then we have some trouble. And so this is exactly what happens. So instead of getting rid of the Canaanites as God had ordered them to, they instead now decide to enslave them. So in Judges chapter 1, we see it says, "And it came to pass, when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaanites under tribute," or under subjugation or slavery, "but they did not completely drive them out." And later we see that it says, "When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers," so now we have another generation who's died off, the ones that entered and possessed the land under Joshua. Now that they have died off, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. And then the children of Israel, this new generation now, did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals, or the false gods. They forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them. And they bowed down, and they provoked the Lord to anger. So this is now a bad thing. In fact, we see that there's this verse in Judges that is kind of the theme verse of the entire book, and it comes in later in chapter 17, and in fact, it's repeated a number of times, but it says this: "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes," which is the best summary verse of this time. Because if we look at this particular time of the cycle and the judges, we're going to look at some interesting thing. And so why do we call it the cycle? Well, the reason why is because this pattern happens 7 different times, right? And so we have this pattern that Israel falls into, and it repeats itself 7 times. So what pattern are we talking about? Well, here it is. The first is sin. The people begin to worship idols and they forget the Lord. After that, subjugation. God uses an enemy, a neighboring enemy, to actually oppress the people. After that, we have prayer, right? The people cry out to God while they are being oppressed. And then we have deliverance, where God raises up a judge. So a judge is actually a rescuer. And then we have a period of rest. So there's a period of peace, which leads right back into number 1, where the people fall into sin again. And so if we look at this timeline of this particular season, this is exactly what happens, right? So we just finish the conquest of Joshua, and the first thing we see is that the people fall into sin and they are oppressed. That's the first one, the Aramaean oppression. So what does God do? He raises up a judge, Othniel, who delivers them out. There's a time of peace and rest. They fall into sin again, and then they are oppressed by a different group, by a different neighbor. And so they cry out to God, and then God raises up another judge, Ehud. And so we see this pattern over and over and over. We see a time of rest, then they fall back into sin, and then God uses the northern Canaanites as the oppressors. They cry out, and then we see Shamgar and Deborah, and as are the people that God calls, and we see this over and over and over. So as we follow the timeline down a little bit, we see that there's a deliverer and then there's an oppression. And then we see this is a long period of time, and it's very dark, and some of the ugliest things of their history happened during this time. And we're not going to go through it other than just to say that there were a couple really important judges during this time. Two specifically. In fact, there's three, but the two that we are going to mention are Gideon and Samson. And of course, these are huge characters that are very important that God would use to bring righteousness upon the people. Neither of them were perfect, but God used them during this time of the judges. And so, but what happens is that we get up to the end of this period, and then we come to the last and final judge. And so that now we come to a person who is going to be a transition. And the last judge of Israel is, of course, this amazing person called Samuel. So who is Samuel? Well, Samuel was the last of the judges, and he was the first great prophet of Israel. And he is important because he marks the transition out of the long, ugly time we know as the judges to this brand new season where we now have the united kingdom of Israel, who are led by three specific kings, and those are, of course, Saul, David, and Solomon. So the cycle of judges, we summarized it really quickly, but there's this repeating pattern that we see, and ultimately it ends with Samuel. And so now we're going to transition in our next part 2 of this course. We're going to stop right here with Samuel, and then in part 2 we're going to pick it up at this next part where we now are going to look at from the kings onward. And so what we're going to do in our next module, last module of this particular course, is we're going to do an overview of everything that part 2 contains. And so join me, if you would, for the last module of this particular course as we look at everything from the United Kingdom to the Messiah.